Welcome to Week 3, Chapter 6. In this chapter, we'll be discussing an all-important process called photosynthesis. I've mentioned this process before in previous presentations. This is the critical metabolic process that takes carbon from carbon dioxide and the energy from sunlight, and together enables life to exist by forming carbon-based compounds. The primary structures that are responsible for this process of photosynthesis, is green algae and green plants. So let's get started. The reason why I wanted to start with this slide is because photons, or packets of energy from sunlight, are the necessary source for all life on Earth. We basically have to infuse energy into living organisms, and we do that through photosynthetic organisms. So photosynthetic organisms take the energy from sunlight in little packets called photons and use pigmented molecules to harness that energy and use that energy through what are called the light-dependent reactions to produce ATP and NADPH. These two molecules will then be further used by the plant cells, specifically in the chloroplast, to take carbon from carbon dioxide and make sugars. The molecules that are responsible for capturing those photons are pigments. And as you can see from this table, there are a large variety of pigments. The primary pigments in plants that are responsible for photosynthesis are your chlorophyll molecules, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. But as you can see, there are other pigmented molecules also in plant cells. These other pigmented molecules belong to a class of molecules called carotenoids. They assist the chlorophyll molecules in taking the energy from sunlight, exciting electrons, and then passing those electrons through a series of enzymatic reactions to produce ATP and NADPH. Here we can see the wavelength of light on the x-axis, and on the y-axis the percentage of light absorbed. All of the different colored lines are the different pigmented molecules that we saw in the previous slide. So in essence, each pigmented molecule responds or absorbs a percentage of light at higher levels at different wavelengths. So for example, if I look at the chlorophyll A, I can see that the chlorophyll A molecule absorbs quite a bit, around 650 nanometers, as well as around 450 nanometers. Whereas chlorophyll B absorbs closer to 500 best, and then also has a peak at around 620. If I was a plant, to get full use of the energy from the sun, it would be an advantage, or it would be at my advantage, to have more than one type of pigment. If I only had chlorophyll A or chlorophyll B, for example, I would only be able to take advantage of the energy of light between 400 and 500 nanometers and 600 and 700 nanometers. I would lose all of the energy from light in the 500 to 600 range. So if an organism, specifically like a plant, has more than one type or class of pigmented molecule, they can take advantage of the full spectrum and basically be more efficient. And that's in essence what this is showing. Now, as I said earlier, photosynthesis is divided into two basic reactions: the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions. The light-dependent reactions are just what their name says. They're dependent upon the energy from sunlight, and they're dependent upon the energy from sunlight to produce our energy, ATP, our electron carrier, NADPH, and molecular oxygen, which is a waste product of photosynthesis, which obviously organisms need for aerobic cellular respiration. The light-independent reactions also known as the Calvin-Benson cycle, are dependent upon the light-dependent reactions, but they are not directly dependent upon light. So they're called light independent because they are not dependent upon the energy from sunlight, although they are dependent upon the products ATP and NADPH from the light dependent reactions. And here we can see this is where the carbon from carbon dioxide comes in. The plant takes carbon dioxide in through its pores, which are called stomata. The carbon dioxide is then combined through a series or a cycle, a metabolic cycle called the Calvin-Benson cycle. It's combined with an ATP, NADPH to produce glucose. Now, when I say combined with ATP and NADPH, I don't mean chemically bound with it. I mean that the ATP and NADPH are necessary to enable the carbon from the carbon dioxide to be put into a usable form by the organism, which is glucose. Structures are, these are chloroplasts, and the chloroplasts are responsible for taking the energy from sunlight and using it to fix carbon into a usable form called glucose. This slide represents plant cells. You can see the rigid cell wall here on the sides. And the little green structures internally inside of each plant cell that look like jelly beans, those are the chloroplasts. And the chloroplasts are the organelles where photosynthesis occurs. Here's an artist's rendition of a chloroplast. And you can see inside of the chloroplast there's a membranous system called thylakoids. The thylakoids, and specifically on the thylakoid membranes, that's where the light-dependent reactions occur. So where they've highlighted this orange cut-in view of a thylakoid membrane, that's where the enzymes that are responsible for taking the energy from sunlight and fixing it, or excuse me, taking the energy from sunlight and using it to produce ATP and NADPH, along with the pigmented molecules, those are located on the thylakoid membrane. Out here is the stroma, and the stroma contains the enzymes for the light-independent reactions. So the stroma will take the products of the light-dependent reactions, which are ATP and NADPH, and use them in the light-independent reactions to fix carbon from carbon dioxide and make sugar. This is a really interesting artist rendition of, imagine you were inside of a chloroplast and you were standing on the surface of a thylakoid and you were kind of looking up and looking out. So up here you see more thylakoid membranes. This watery-ish environment would be the stroma. And these, which are on the surface, it's a zoomed-in view of the surface of the thylakoid membrane, would be where your pigmented molecules are located and organized into light harvesting complexes as well as photosystems. And these are the primary components necessary or needed for the light-dependent reactions. So let's go into a little bit more depth on those light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. As you can see here, it has been broken down into 7 basic steps. Notice where we are located. So if we look at this little view here, we are taking one thylakoid membrane and zooming in on it. So the orange again is the thylakoid membrane, which we discussed in the previous slides. And in here is the thylakoid compartment. Out here would be the stroma, and this is where the enzymes for the light-independent reactions would be. So if I basically start at step 1, step 1 is taking the energy from sunlight, so those are the photons, and the energy from sunlight is harnessed by pigmented molecules, such as our chlorophyll A's, our chlorophyll B's, our carotenoid molecules. And it's all harnessed and basically magnified. That energy by that light harvesting antenna is kind of amped up and is dumped into what's called a reaction center, which is where our chlorophyll molecules are. And it's so strong that it's used to eject electrons from this photosystem. And that's what we see here. We see the electrons being ejected from the photosystem. Now, before we follow what happens with those electrons that are ejected, we have to replenish the electrons of the photosystem, because if we didn't, I mean, they're leaving, so we've got to put some in. So that's step 2. And what step 2 is taking the electrons from the splitting of water. So it's termed photolysis. So here we have our water molecule, and that water molecule is split into oxygen, hydrogen, and electrons. And the electrons are fed into the photosystem.